to introduce to you our speaker for today. His name is Kyriakos Parponas. Kyriakos is one of the experts, in fact, of this program, GAP for EPR. Kyriakos has a profound understanding of solid waste management, recycling, and the circular economy. Kyriakos has played instrumental roles in supporting and managing EPR systems across continents and in different countries. So it's a privilege to have him here today to help us understand and navigate this transition towards mandatory EPR in Malaysia. So his insights are invaluable, and I'm eager to share his expertise with us. So without further ado, I extend a warm welcome to Kyriakos, and I invite him to enlighten us with his insights. So Kyriakos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto, and hi to everybody. Pleasure to be here with you and try to share some of the basics of EPR and the potential evolution of EPR in Malaysia. Of course, the discussion we will have will be what we expect eventually to be the case also in Malaysia when things start becoming more demanding on the transition from voluntary EPR to mandatory EPR, and is building, of course, on international experience, a lot of examples from Europe where it all began and where it's applied, I would say, the most. But this is something that is becoming very, very international. And as Roberto was saying, we had the opportunity over the last few years to work in different countries and different continents, including Asia. I personally had the chance to do some work in Indonesia, in Philippines, and Thailand in the last couple of years. And of course, very delighted to be able to support the evolution in Malaysia as well. So I would say that we will try in the next 45-50 minutes to share a lot of information. I know it will be overwhelming in the sense that it's too much information, but of course the slides and the presentation will be shared with you so that you can go back, and some slides I will pass very quickly because you can go back and get into more detail if you want, so that we leave some time at the end of this meeting today for your questions, for discussion on the material. So diving in directly into the material, let me start by saying a few things about the evolution. How did we get where we are today with the extended producer responsibility and the role of the industry? We know that waste has been traditionally in the past the business of the government, either directly or indirectly through local government, local authorities, and so on. So taking care of it, paying for it to the extent that they take care of it, but eventually got to a point where governments were thinking that someone should pay for this, and primarily the industry, that is, by putting their products on the market, they pollute the environment eventually with these products at the end of their life or with their packaging and so on. So the first idea for finding someone to pay was, of course, naturally to think of a tax the companies so that we get the money from the companies and do the business, pay for waste management. Eventually, that took a different spin towards asking the industry to more directly and more practically take responsibility for the waste. So not just paying, but also participating in the operational side of things. And additionally, not only paying for the waste at the end of their life, but also improving their products so that there is less waste, or there is easier to address, to collect and recycle waste over the life of the product. So eventually we ended up with EPR starting from Europe in the 90s. And of course, already in Europe, we have mandatory EPR as an obligation to the member states, not only for packaging, but also for electrical and electronic waste, batteries, end-of-life vehicles. And of course, in many member states at the national level, they have extended producer responsibility to other waste streams like oils, tires, fabrics, and so on. Actually, fabrics are now an obligation in the EU by 2026, if I'm not wrong, to set up EPR for fabrics as well. If we see the evolution of that, in the 90s, it was Europe, and you see the first picture on the left, where we have the dark green, and eventually by 2020, that was an international tool, financial tool used internationally already, and you see how it's spread over the globe, and of course, sometimes voluntary, but eventually moving into mandatory, and you see the expectation by 2025, more and more countries are turning this into a mandatory obligation of the industry. Even in the States, we already have now 3 states that have mandatory EPR for packaging. So things are moving quite quickly. And that demonstrates also that the tool has been successful, has been providing results. So more and more countries are joining this idea of using this financial tool. Now, in most of the cases, it starts from packaging, and it's not a coincidence. Packaging is a complicated waste stream. It's a waste stream that to a great extent is mixed with municipal solid waste, and that makes it more difficult to recover because it's widespread in the households. And of course, packaging is also produced on a daily basis, like we produce food waste. Every day we produce packaging. It's a very visible waste stream. It's branded, so even if you go to the landfill, the only thing that you see branded is packaging. So it's easier for governments to think, okay, someone has to pay for this waste. And of course, the great challenge, and we see here household waste and what we call commercial industrial waste in Europe, the secondary and tertiary packaging. The right part of the slide is the easy part, and in many cases, either through informal or formal sector, is managed already because it's financially feasible to manage it. But the big challenge is the household packaging, which is not financially feasible to manage it in most of the cases. And of course, household packaging in most of the markets, it's 70% of the packaging put on the market. So we cannot just ignore it because we cannot reach high packaging recycling rates unless we start collecting household packaging. And that's where things become more complicated, both operationally and financially, because there is a funding gap, and we need funding to collect this material, and we need organized collection of packaging to address this kind of material. And this is something we will have in the discussion later on today. How do we envisage things to evolve also in Malaysia over time? So what are the key objectives of EPR? And I'm starting from the right part, saying that first of all is to divert material from landfilling, so collect material so that we can manage it. And of course, to do that, we need to encourage the separate collection of packaging, because once the packaging is mixed with other types of waste, especially organic waste, it makes it very difficult, very expensive, and of course, even more difficult to have good quality recycling because we have dirty packaging already because of throwing everything in the same bin. So sorting at source is a very important element of high quality recycling. And of course, as we said earlier, the idea behind EPR was also to encourage, to give incentives to people, to companies to design better products, more friendly, so that they can more easily be collected and recycled and so on. Now, if we come to the essence of EPR and how it could be applied when we pass responsibility to the industry basically undertakes different types of responsibilities. One, of course, is to design better products, as we said, through the incentives provided by paying packaging fees. So the disincentives, let's say, provided by paying packaging fees, so that they design better products to also reduce their packaging fees. They also have to make sure that they have systems in place to sort at source and collect packaging so that it could be reused, recycled, or disposed safely with energy recovery or other types of disposal at the end of the chain. And of course, at the same time, to educate the consumers so that they actually participate in sorting their waste so that we have good quality material. in the heart of this system, we need an organization, a system, an institution which facilitates this process. And if we see the left part picture of the slide, we have this EPR organization, producer responsibility organization, sitting in the middle of the evolution of packaging, making sure that the circle is keep running, it's keep going in circles. So we have the use of primary material to produce packaging, which is then passed on to fillers to put their products on. It ends up to the consumers at the retail stores to buy, then consume, and then set up systems so that the citizens can return their packaging, pass through preparation for recycling, and then recycle back into raw materials so that we can produce either new packaging or new products, and we kept this circle going. And the institution sitting in the middle, having contractual and financial relationships with the different players in the supply chain, has a very crucial role, which we will touch upon later on as well. What is the essence of EPR? First of all, we have, of course, the shift of waste management responsibilities and the costs from the government or local government to the producers, to the industry. Those costs include costs for collection, sorting, and recycling of the material, and communication costs to sensitize the society. And the share of the cost paid may vary from country to country. For example, in Europe, although it's already in the great majority of the countries, producers are paying the full cost, 100% of the cost for this collection, sorting, treatment, and communication. But there is a minimum requirement that it should be at least 80%. But as I said, in Europe, it's already 100%. Now, producers have the option in the legislation usually to do it individually or collectively. Of course, it's very difficult, very unpractical, and most of the times very costly or even impossible to do it individually. So usually we have the collective undertaking of this responsibility by setting up these producer responsibility organizations. And in Europe, I should say that the legislation allows individual compliance, but in most of the countries at the same time is encouraging collective undertaking of the responsibility. The PROs should fulfill the obligation of its members, the companies that join the PRO, in the most efficient and effective way. And that's an important part of the industry taking part in the evolution, so that it ensures that this is done efficiently and effectively. And of course, the idea is to meet the recycling targets that are usually set by the government. So targets are set, they grow over time, and the PRO, the industry through the PROs are trying to meet this recycling target. We are saying that based on best practices, PROs should be not-for-profit entities fully owned by the obliged industry, but there are different models. But we see best results when we have these conditions. And later on, we'll discuss the direction taken already in Malaysia, which is in the right direction in the sense that you're thinking of a single PRO, not-for-profit, and so on. The idea, of course, behind EPR is that the industry is paying the fees, but those fees are eventually internalized in the products, in the prices of the products. So it's the consumers at the end of the day paying. But by having the industry paying these fees at the first level, they have the incentives also to improve their products, because nobody wants to increase the price of their product. So the incentive is already in place to also design better products. Now, it's easy to understand that packaging has an upstream, a midstream, and a downstream side. So from extracting raw materials to produce a product, to then consume it and reach the end of its life, and the need to treat this material at the end of the life. Truth is, if we look also back into the main objectives of EPR, EPR has been more successful on managing the downstream, on collecting and recycling waste, and we've seen recycling targets, recycling rates going very quickly up in countries using EPR, but it has not been so successful in incentivizing the better design of products. And in Europe already, to address this, there is an obligation to eco-modulate the fees. So you set up the fees in a way that penalize material that is not easy to treat or is not treated, and give an incentive with a lower fee for the materials that are easier to dismantle, recycle, and so on. So because of the, let's say, sluggish performance of EPR in the midstream part, we already have this obligation to eco-modulate the fees so that they also address the third, let's say, aim of EPR to improve the design of products. Now, in terms of different ways to apply EPR and the different EPR models, there are of course a lot of different models. We will not get into the details of everything, but what usually shapes, let's say, the different types of EPR is the type of responsibility, whether that responsibility is only financial or organizational and financial. So how much involvement does the industry have in the management of the end life of the product? And in certain cases, depending on the waste stream, especially for waste streams that are more commercial, it could be only financial, but for packaging, in the great majority of the cases, we have both financial and organizational responsibility. The other issue is the way the cost for packaging is shared between the involved actors, between the government, the local authorities, the producers, the waste management organizations, and so on. So what is the sharing? How much of that cost is taken up by the producers and so on? And here we also have different approaches, but as I said, in Europe, already the cost is 100% in most of the countries. The other question is whether there is competition between PROs. Is there one PRO per packaging waste stream or multiple PROs per waste stream? That also is an important issue because it changes the dynamics when there are competing PROs, and of course there are advantages and disadvantages in each case. And of course the other issue is the level of transparency between the PROs and the way they are monitored and controlled by the state. And how, of course, one of the important issues, how is to make sure that when there is an obligation, mandatory EPR, we ensure that the whole industry, all the producers are paying their fees. How do we deal with free riding, let's say, of certain companies? Now, these are different models that we find in Europe. As I said, I will not go into the details, but of course we have cases where we have a single PRO. We have cases where we have multiple PROs, not-for-profit PROs, for-profit PROs competing. Some more industry-based models like the tradable credit models in the UK, which is changing now. It's changing back into a more EPR-like system. So there are different alternatives. And trying to kind of map the differences between the different types of implementation of EPR. We built up this table, analyzing and comparing at different levels the changes in the number of PROs, whether it's a single or multiple PROs, whether they are for profit or not for profit, the profit orientation, the industry setup, whether it's individual or compliance or collective compliance, and the ownership of the PRO, whether the PRO belongs to the industry. As we said, this is the idea, but there is a few cases where the state also takes part in the ownership of the PRO. I will not get into the details. You can read the material later, but this analyzes the different approaches on the way the fees are collected, the financial side of things, the transparency we find depending on the type of the PRO. How do we manage free riders? How do we make sure that the industry is there is a level playing field between the producers? They are all paying their fees. And of course, what is the control, what is the monitoring of these PROs and how it changes when there is a different setup. In the last part of the table, I highlight the problematic areas with each approach, starting from the number of PROs. It's usually the natural thing of people in the economics to think that if we have competition, prices will go down, we have better results because there is competition between the PROs. The important part here is that this is not a perfect market where the competition works as we know in the markets. And the main reason is because the supply in this case is not flexible. We will not produce more packaging waste because there is competition at the PRO level. So if you have a rigid and inflexible supply, it means that if you increase competition on the demand of the packaging waste, you may end up by raising prices because the supply is limited, or diverting the money to areas that is not really needed, like the commercial and industrial packaging, which is the easy part and not the complicated. Again, for the profit or not profit, the question is, I mean, PROs have a public role, and the question is whether the industry should have any profit out of this public role that they have to take. So we say that based on best practices, not for profit is better. Individual compliance is very fragmented. It's almost impossible for the state to manage a market where each company is trying to meet their obligations separately, individually. And of course, if we have the state involved in the EPR, there is lack of transparency, and in most of the cases, the money that is collected is not directed towards the management of packaging, but it usually fills up other gaps in the national budget. So it's interesting and very encouraging that we see already through the discussions we had with MAREA that Malaysia is also taking the approach of having not for profit, a single PRO if possible, concentrating directly on meeting recycling targets and collecting and recycling packaging. Now, a few things about the Malaysian context. The first part of the work we did already with MAREA is to look at what's happening already in the market. So I will not say too much. This is your country, you're there. Most of you know what's happening. But what we see is that the country depends a lot on landfilling and dumping waste, although there is an increasing recycling rate of material up to 35% in 2023. This is what is reported. And of course, the country is already having more ambitious targets. There was a target for 40% of recycling by 2020. This was not achieved, so it was pushed to 2025, but it's already 35%, so it should be more or less close to be met in 2025. However, this is done primarily through the informal sector, through informal collection of packaging. There is very limited sorting at source, which will become instrumental as the targets go up. The public awareness, of course, is low, and it's inevitable since people are not participating to a great extent to the actual sorting of material. So unless they are educated and they are provided with a system to sort at source, it's inevitable that this will be low. There are fluctuating recycling capacities. We know how the imports of plastic waste, primarily after the China Green Wall, increase the capacities. Now, some of these capacities are decreasing. When you stop or limit importing, that capacity will go down. There is voluntary EPR initiatives like MAREA, but no mandatory EPR. There is limited interest by producers since there is no obligation. We have the bigger companies that have their own targets being involved, but smaller companies are not so much involved. And if you are not paying, it's not natural that you will be too much interested in paying, but eventually through mandatory EPR, things will start falling in place. And of course, a starting point will be the legal framework, which is still missing, which will be kind of map the way EPR should be implemented in Malaysia. And of course, One of the important issues that we'll touch upon later on is the early participation of the industry, which is critical in, let's say, helping the country to shape up the legal framework, because believe me, and I've been in many countries, the government and the people at the government will know less about EPR than some of you. So by participating and sharing examples from abroad, it will also shape up a better legislation. I'm showing here the something that is similar to what is happening today in Malaysia. This is from Philippines, where there is also initiatives with a PRO, voluntary PRO, to start addressing the EPR, and I've been doing some work in Philippines. What I wanted to demonstrate here, because I saw that evolution in Philippines for a while, and there was a lot of emphasis by the companies there and the PRO how to deal with the informal sector, which is what you see in the red box there, the informal sector, and trying to improve, let's say, the monitoring of the material and the monitoring of the numbers reported to the PRO by the informal sector. Based on my experience and international experience, it will never be possible to fully control an informal sector working in the gray market, avoiding a lot of other obligations, to be so open, so to declare properly material, recycle, and so on. So to me, irrespective of the efforts made, it will always be a black box for the industry, because you cannot ensure that the numbers you are buying from X recycler are not at the same time sold to another producer, or to another producer, or to another producer. So at the end of the day, this is a black box for the industry, although you're trying to improve the monitoring of the numbers. So I should say that both because of increased recycling rates and the need to have control over the numbers and over the operations, you need to think of organized collection of packaging as well. Now, key issues, some of the basic definitions and key issues in EPR, and I will go very quickly through it, but one important issue at least on, or let's say, the prevailing definition of the producer that we see around the globe is that we consider the producer the company that first puts product on the market. That means that it's either the filler, the brand owner, or the importer of packed products. Now, there are variations, and there is a few cases where other supply chain members are taking responsibility, but the prevailing model is that the financial responsibility is on the brand owners and the importers of packed products. The producer responsibility, of course, the producer has to set up the system, finance the collection and treatment of packaging. The producers usually join a PRO, collectively undertake the responsibility, and transfer their packaging obligations to the PRO they join. And of course, if it's one PRO in the market, joins the PRO. And of course, the way producers take responsibilities by paying fees to the PRO, so that the PRO will collect the amounts of material needed to meet the recycling targets and so on. Packaging fees are incorporated in the product prices. This is in Europe, it's in the legislation that the fees will eventually be passed on the prices of the products. And of course, depending on the governance and the setup of the PRO organization, and that also is dependent on the company law in each country. How do you set up this not-for-profit entity? So depending on the way you set up this entity, the producers can take different roles. I will not get into any details. Some of the key principles of EPR, and this is with the exception of the red point there, come directly from European legislation as the principles of EPR. It's saying that there should be a clear separation of rules and responsibility of all the relevant actors involved. So producers, local authorities, citizens should be clear what are the responsibilities. The ownership, it should be limited to the obliged industry, so the brand owners and the importer of packed products, to avoid conflicts of interest. Not-for-profit setup, it's not a requirement in the legislation, but we say that it's based on best practices, the best model. It should have measurable waste management targets. It should be transparent in the reporting. It should equally treat producers irrespective of their size. So producers should pay EPR fees based on the same catalog of fees per type of material. It should share information with consumers, educate the consumer, but also inform them of the results of the PRO. It should be transparent. The cost coverage should reflect the end-of-life cost of its product. So it should be a cost. The fee should be calculated on a cost basis. Cost efficiency means that EPR should have a clearly defined geographical product and material coverage. So it's perfectly clear what are the obligations and how the funding is collected and used. Fee modulation, as I said, this is becoming also now an obligation, eco-modulated fees, so that we give incentives to improve the products. And of course, the state has still a very important role to monitor the enforcement of EPR. And we always repeat to the state that passing on the responsibility does not mean that you are out of the picture. In fact, you have a very important role to play by monitoring the EPR and making sure that everything is working properly. If we see some of the key stakeholders, I was talking earlier about the key stakeholders taking their role, and of course, some of the problems we have around the globe is when the key stakeholders do not understand or do not take their role properly. So we have the packaging producers. We defined already based on best practices, that is brand owners and importers. We have the state, we have the recyclers that will recycle the material. We have the waste operators that will be involved in the collection and sorting of the material so that it ends up to the recyclers. And those could be based on the conditions, municipal operators or private waste operators. The citizens, who have a very important role because they sort their waste, and of course they pay eventually the fees as well. And the municipalities, that depending on the model and the maturity of the municipalities, may take a greater or a smaller role depending on the country. And of course, as we said, in the heart of this evolution, we have the producer responsibility organization that connects all these stakeholders by providing funding and also managing the relationships between them. I will not again get into much more detail in that, but I will just say a couple of things on the packaging producers and the PRO, which are the key stakeholders that we are interested here. The packaging producers are usually the owners or members of the PRO, depending on the institutional setup. So it's an organization that belongs to the producers. It finances with packaging fees the greatest part of the PRO budget, and we'll say a few things later on these costs. And of course, the producers declare their packaging to the PRO, what they put on the market, either on a quarterly, biannually, or annually basis. This decision is made by the PRO. And of course, the PRO is the organization, could be not-for-profit institution, not-for-profit distribution, depending on the company law. But that company, that organization represents many producers collectively. It collects money from these producers and finances the collection, sorting, and treatment of the material. In many cases, it manages also, technically manages the projects for collection, sorting, and treatment of material, depending on the setup. We say that the PRO for the material collected with organized collection should also own the material collected and sell this material, which will lower also the fees when we have organized collection. It reports to the state on the achievement of recycling targets and the way the finances are used. And of course, it works to sensitize people to participate in sorting at source. I will leave you the rest of the material for the other stakeholders to read at your own time. but I'm concentrating now on producers. Now, what are the benefits of EPR to the society? First of all, it triggers the necessary investments in the country's infrastructure. So through the funding provided by the producers, we have investments in the infrastructure of a country. It encourages separate waste collection and recycling, and it's helping member states in Europe and countries around the globe to meet their recycling targets. It significantly contributes to the modernization of the waste management in the country, because EPR is about re-engineering the waste management sector, not just collecting funds. It reduces landfilling by diverting material from landfilling. It reduces the negative impacts on public health and the environment. And of course, it creates new jobs in the country. The rule of thumb is that for every job we replace in landfilling, through recycling, if the recycling is done in the country, we create 35 new jobs in the country. What are the benefits for the industry, though? Because the industry that is usually not paying for their packaging, now they have to pay for their packaging. What are the benefits, though, for the industry? Well, EPR is an efficient policy tool in modern waste management. So by using an efficient tool, when you have to pay, you can pay less. The producers, in this case, are in charge of the management, the collection and sorting of their material once they reach the end of their life. So it's not that somebody else makes the decision and you are asked to pay the bill, but you are part of the decision and you are part of setting up the bill. EPR provides incentives for eco-design, so improving products, and through improving products, also improving the image of the company in the market. It protects the industry, significantly protects the industry from taxation or other similar state initiatives. So if the government is already decided to ask the industry to pay, unless you get involved to push for an efficient EPR, you might end up with the taxation, because if the government sees no interest, the natural thing is to say, okay, I can still put a law in place and tax company. So you are losing the opportunity to be in control of the cost and be in control of how money is spent as well. It helps the industry to avoid loopholes in the legal framework if it's undertaken early. So I'm saying that early participation will give you the opportunity to shape up the legislation with the government. It offers speed, flexibility, and lower costs to the industry. It helps the industry and the local authorities to acquire an environmentally positive profile. It is the first step towards green business, which becomes a profitable business as we move along. And it's a first step for you. There is a duplication there. So, yeah. So going from voluntary to mandatory then, these are some of the key issues that we have, key differences we have between voluntary and mandatory EPR. I would say that mandatory systems, in mandatory systems, the obligations are very well defined, and companies know what they have to do. In voluntary systems, it's open to different interpretations. There is a level playing field because all the companies are asked to pay. So it's not that some companies take initiatives like in voluntary schemes and other companies are not interested or not paying. It takes, of course, an effort to make sure that everybody pays. But if there is a legislation in place, there should be a way to enforce it as well. We have because funding is ongoing, it is based on the different obligation and recycling targets. There is funding to set up organized systems around the country. The compliance can be precisely controlled because they are based on legislation and regulations. And it's, of course, easier to build up a sustainable waste management system because there is a system in place, there are obligations over time, and there is sustainable funding of these operations as we move along. So a lot of things start falling in place when there is an obligation and the industry is obliged to take the responsibility collectively. What is the risk of not being involved early? First of all, is missing the opportunity. And I'm talking now about the industry. What are the risks of not being involved, you are missing the opportunity to be part of the key decisions and the mechanics for the evolution of EPR, to work with the government towards that and drive them away from installing a tax, for example, that you will not be involved at all. You're missing the opportunity to participate in setting up the structure of the EPR, the organization, the PRO, or even to participate in the decision making of the PRO overall, if you're late in the process. You're missing the opportunity to engage early with the other stakeholders that will be involved, municipalities, waste operators, recyclers. They might be making decisions on your behalf that you will be paying for later on if you don't participate. And of course, there's always the risk to be finger pointed by the public that you're not taking responsibility, and at the same time taking responsibility for your waste, for your packaging, and also missing the opportunity to be part of the circular economy evolving and the business opportunities that are associated with the circularity. Why we need a PRO? We already said a lot. It's in the heart of the evolution. So I will not get into the details. I will let you. There is 3 or 4 slides on the role of the PRO that you can read through. I will pass them on. We can discuss them in the Q&A as well if you want. So these are slides on the role of the PRO. Now, the next part is the discussion on organized collection versus collection by the informal sector. These are the recycling rates that we have in Europe for 2025 and 2030 for package. So you easily see that there are targets on the different materials in excess of 70 to 80%. So we're talking about very high recycling targets. Of course, they come after an evolution over the years where the targets were lower, but now the targets are as high as 80 to 85% per type of material. And of course, knowing that you also lose some material naturally in the process, when we talk about recycling targets of 85%, it's like saying that we need to collect everything of that material, all the material put on the market so that we can reach a recycling target of 80 to 85%. And what I would like to highlight is that if you're having this kind of recycling targets, it's next to impossible to expect that with only an informal system, which focuses on materials that have that they make sense financially to collect, like aluminum or PET, to reach these kind of high recycling targets just with this system. And of course, the inevitable is that Malaysia eventually will be moving also in this direction, that we have circular economy initiatives. The country is already participating in this kind of international agreements on plastics. The companies have their own recycled content initiatives in their products. In Europe, there is already an obligation for certain types of packaging for high recycled content in the material. All these pressures will push the recycling targets up. And of course, increasingly, it will be becoming very difficult to collect this kind of material and this kind of quantities only with informal sector. And there will be a need to shift from recycling certificates to organized collection of packaging, where you ask people to sort their waste and you have a system in place to collect this packaging in an organized way and treat it. So it will become inevitable, and it will eventually become required to collect packaging also with an organized system. Now, a few things about the informal sector, which is important, of course, and it's important in Asia, even more important because you have a significant informal sector, and that the need to integrate this informal sector. Just going back to the main, let's say, key players, we usually have in organized collection waste operators and recyclers, those that collect, sort sort the material, and then the recyclers that take up the material. When you have the informal sector, this waste operators part, which is part of organized collection, is usually done by the informal sector, waste pickers, who will collect packaging and take it to the recyclers, sort it in the process, and take it to the recyclers directly. So in terms of the informal sector internationally, there is significant informal sector operators, especially in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, less in Europe, but more in the South. These are just some numbers. We're talking about 20 million people. They already play an important role because they divert a lot of the waste from the landfill. But of course, it's very important to eventually integrate these people in organized waste management, so they will also improve in the way they operate and in the way they live and the way they, let's say, are part of this waste management sector. You see, in Europe, the numbers are only, informal sector is only concentrated in the Balkans area. So for Central and Northern Europe, it's not really an issue. So when we draw experiences from EPR and EPR integration, we look more into experiences from other parts of the world. We, of course, have in the Balkans area informal sector, and what we see there is that there is informal sector, and in parallel, because it's an obligation in the EU, there are formal systems for the collection of packaging. And if you fail to integrate these people, they will, of course, oppose the formal collection, and they will create a lot of problems in formal collection. They will vandalize the equipment. They will get them, and when I'm saying equipment, I mean bins that you put to collect the packaging. And of course, they will be also collecting a lot of the material from the bins. So you set up a formal system, but it's not really working efficiently because you have not integrated the informal sector. So it's important in any case to integrate the informal sector. Now, it takes a lot of effort. You see here some examples. This is an example from Colombia. And you see that they took an initiative to integrate with the informal sector, the street collectors. And of course, you see 7, 8 different stakeholders that need to work, like different ministries, municipalities, the waste operators and recyclers, their associations, the NGOs, and the EPR organization to work collectively in order to integrate the informal sector. So it's an effort that takes the participation of a lot of stakeholders, including the government. So it's not something that the EPR will do alone. You see here examples from Chile. This is another very important initiative where in Chile, they decided to create a system of training and certifying waste pickers. So people that are in the informal sector can participate in training, become certified as collector, sorter, recycler, and so on. And then they can take jobs in the upcoming waste management sector using their certificates and make a good living out of it. So they created this system of training and upscaling the informal sector. And there are also results of this work that shows it works for the integration of informal sector. Now, some of the financial implications of the EPR, I'm touching a bit now upon fee calculation. When we look at the cost and the income of a PRO, we have on the side of the income, we have the packaging fees where we collect money from the industry. We have the income from the sale of material. If the material belongs to the PRO from organized collection, in a mature PRO, it could cover up to 30 or 40% of the income of the PRO. And in terms of the cost, we have collection costs, sorting costs, cost for treatment of the material and residuals, material that cannot be recycled or taken to waste to energy facilities, or the residuals and so on. The communication cost, and of course the administration cost needed to run the PRO. If we think of a mature PRO over time, you can see there the percentages more or less of this cost. So about 50% would be cost for collection, organized collection, 25 sorting, and so on and so forth. So this is the structure of the cost of a mature PRO with organized collection. And of course, here we just explain what's the collection, what's the sorting cost, and so on. In terms of organizational structure, it doesn't have to be like this, but in many cases, we find similar structures. We have usually the board of directors that it's a board of directors made up of the industry that has the obligation, the financial obligation for packaging. We try to run PROs as flexibly as possible, like commercial organizations with small and flexible members, small and flexible boards, 7 to 11 members. It's not like a fixed number, but we're trying to keep it flexible. And of course, then there is the structure through a CEO or a general manager. And usually we find a finance department, a commercial department, and a technical department, financial, of course, managing funds and the distribution of funding, a commercial department dealing with communication with citizens, but also dealing with the members, the industry, the declarations, and so on. And the technical department that oversees and monitors the operational side of the PRO, meaning collection, sorting, and so on and so forth. These services are usually provided, collection, sorting, by waste management operators or the municipalities, usually with competitive selection of operators, but they need to be, of course, monitor those contracts by the PRO. In terms of declarations, I'm just showing here an example of a declaration, a packaging declaration to a PRO. And you see here that in the bottom part, there is all the details of each type of packaging, the type, the family, the material, the quantities, the weights, and so on and so forth. You see, and of course, there is kind of a setup in the declaration which collects all the information at the top. So you see that each company will have to declare per declaration period all the packaging they put on the market by type of material. And of course, through that, we calculate the total packaging put on the market and eventually the fees that the company will pay based on the catalog of fees of the PRO. Very quickly, how we calculate the fees. The idea is to use a cost-based formula, which means that we need the net cost of the material for each material. So the cost to collect plus the cost to sort, these are the basic costs. Of course, the allocation of other costs as well, minus the value from the sale of the material. So if the material belongs to the PRO, it sells each type of the material, and that is taken out of the cost of that material, divided by the quantity put on the market by the PRO for each type of material. So we calculate the fee on the packaging footprint, on the total amount of material put on the market, by netting the cost. And of course, the cost we allocate is the cost we need for the year to collect and recycle that part of the package. So we calculate based on what we are going to collect, what we need to collect, but we divide by the footprint, and the fees are paid on the total material put on the market. In terms of setting up the fees, you see here two different options. One is more granulated than the other. We definitely prefer the granulated, the more granulated setup of fees, where each material is having a different fee, and where we separate also between household fees and commercial industrial fees, which demonstrates also the differences in the cost between the different types of packaging. In terms of the calculation, and this is not for you to read numbers, but very quickly to grasp the idea. We have the quantities put on the market. This is at the top is the packaging footprint. We have the different costs for collecting and sorting and treatment of the material and dealing with residuals. Then we subtract the value of the materials, the blue box here. It's the amount of money we make out of selling the material, so that we have the net cost. We add any other cost, beans, cleaning of beans, and so on. And then we divide it by the material put on the market, by the footprint. So we end up at the bottom line with the fees for the type of the material for different years. This is based on a 5-year planning period, which is usually the period that we apply for the licensing of a PRO. So we get usually 5-year license. This is a more complicated calculation for a bin with different material. So it's a mixed packaging bin, which is then sorted at the sorting station. The idea is the same: cost per type of material allocated by the quantity of the material minus the value of that material, and then divided by the amount of material put on the market. And we do the same calculation for household. We do it here for commercial industrial packaging. And here you can more or less kind of recognize more of what you're doing today at MAREA and what you're doing in Malaysia with the informal sector, where you don't have collection cost, sorting cost, minus the value of the material. You have an incentive paid to a waste operator or an informal sector operator who does the work for you. Likewise, we do in the commercial industrial packaging. We pay the industry to report the material they collect and recycle because they do it already. It's financially feasible to do it. And we calculate, of course, much lower fees from commercial industrial packaging because of the value of the material that already finances the collection and sorting of the material. And we end up with a set of fees granulated between the different types of material, granulated between household and commercial industrial packaging. And of course, here we show the comparison between different countries. We shouldn't compare between countries actually, because you need to know the context in each country, but this is just to show to a new country. Let's say this calculation, for example, this example was for Armenia, and we were showing to Armenia how their fees relate to other countries, although, as I said, direct comparisons are not possible. But you can also recognize here that some countries have very high fees, especially in Europe, on certain types of material, depending on where they focus. They might inject more money in certain materials to collect more quantities, especially as the recycling rates go up. I would close this so that we can have some discussion as well by touching upon 2 or 3 things that were recently presented by European, the chairman of European, which is an association of the packaging producers in Europe. So these come directly from a presentation from the industry, why they prefer EPR. And he was saying that basically it's a system that provides effectiveness and efficiency to the industry. The interests are straightforward, and the industry is in charge of those operations. So they have a control on the amount of collected material. They have efficiency in the collection and sorting cost, and they have also high quality of secondary material through the EPR implementation. EPR makes sure that the industry is part of the evolution, and EPR and the funding collected is not like an ATM where each other stakeholder will go and collect money. So it's not an open, let's say, check where each other stakeholder will go and ask money for. And of course, it's not paying for waste management, but it is paying only for circularity of packaging. And that is facilitated with EPR, is limited to meet legal circularity objectives, not paying for waste management. It is industry-owned, not for profit distribution, and this is the prevailing model, then the preferred model by the industry. So ability to design and execute waste management strategy is also part of the, let's say, part of what the EPR does. And the preference is to single compliance system with competition at operational level. So no competition between compliance systems, not competition between PROs, but competing on service providers. And again, this is a preferred model for the industry in Europe, based on the experience they already have out of 30 to 35 years of implementation of EPR in Europe. Thank you. I know it was a bit long and with too much information, but take the opportunity to ask me questions and clarify things. Thank you for listening to me.
Great. That was absolutely great. And, I want to give you a round of applause. So you packed certainly quite a lot of information in this, an hour, almost an hour. I think it was worth it. Let me just remind everybody that we will share the presentation. Also, the GAP for EPR project produced a status report on the Malaysian situation. This report will also be shared with all of you. Some of this information you already know, but it's nice to have everything in one report, so we will share that as well, okay? Before we go to the questions, let me just remind you that together with Kyriakos, we also have another expert working for MAREA, with MAREA, in this GAP for EPR project. His name is Rodrigo Luman, and I want to take this opportunity also to thank Rodrigo for being part of this project, but also because you are still awake and you're still with us, in spite of there being, what, 4:30 in the morning in Chile, because he's in Chile right now, Rodrigo. So thank you very much for being with us and for supporting this project. So let's go to the questions. I can see there are already a few questions in the chat box, and 2 or 3 of them are from Dr. Casper. Dr. Casper, I think it's better if you take the floor, you unmute yourself, and please feel free to pose the questions yourself directly.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto, and thanks, Mr. Papronas, for the presentation. Very insightful. Is my sound okay there? I'm just checking the bandwidth. I have a big
Yeah,
in the house. All
yeah,
good.
very good.
Okay, so just on the first question, and sorry for all the questions. I mean, I have many, many more. It will be interesting to have this conversation with you. So I'm based here in Southeast Asia and Thailand. I'm from Coca-Cola, and I've been working on EPR systems also 25 years. I'm curious to know, with your experience in the region specifically, what financial instruments. So if you look at EPR systems globally, there are many financial instruments available to the legislator. So it could be a deposit system for bottles. It could be a raw material fee. It could be a product tax. It could be a material fee or packaging fee. I think is the one that you've mentioned specifically in your presentation. It could be a tax on disposal. What financial instrument do you think would be best, suited for Malaysia? And then what role do the other producers, who I call them other obligated entities that are not in your definition of producers, what role do they play? So I'm talking about in PET, the resin manufacturer, the FENC Induramas of the world. I mean, they are not an obligated entity in your definition. What role should they play? And converters, for example, that Tetra Pak, I mean, they convert, they're not a brand owner. They basically scot-free in terms of your definition of EPR. If you can answer those 2 questions, thanks.
Well, let me start from the second question. The definition I'm using, I would say, is the prevailing definition we find in most of the world. Is the definition in Europe let's say, 95% of the countries, and it's the prevailing definition in other countries as well. When we say that it's brand owners, fillers, and meaning brand owners and importers of packaging. That does not mean that it leaves the rest of the stakeholders out of the obligation. It leaves them out of the financial obligation, but usually in the legislation, they are also definitely part of the supply chain. And of course, they have an obligation to accept material back, to recycle material, depending on their role, whether they are the manufacturers of packaging or the resin manufacturers and so on. So they are left out of the financial obligation because the idea is to pass the financial obligation, and that touches upon also the incentive that EPR tries to give to companies for the improvement of the products. It passes the obligation to the company that has most of the control on the package. And when we have a filler, the filler usually will decide about the type of material, it will decide about the thickness of material, the design of the material, the layers of packaging. It's not the packaging manufacturer or the resin manufacturer that makes the decision is usually the brand owner of the product, the filler of the product. So that's why the prevailing model is passing the financial responsibility on these companies. Now, there are other examples, and there are countries, even in Europe, for example, in Italy, where the packaging manufacturers pay the fee. And there are some cases in the international market where either resin producers or packaging manufacturers like Tetra Pak and other companies are paying the fees. But the prevailing model is the brand owners and the importers of packed products. The challenge with the other stakeholders is that packaging, at least in the European legislation, is put on the market, and the fees are paid for the packaging put on the market. And put on the market means it's sold to the consumer. If you are asking the converter or the packaging manufacturer to pay for the packaging, it's never clear whether the packaging was put on the market. It could be in a storage area, it could be for an expired product. It never ended up in the market per se, the way we consider it put on the market in Europe. That's why also the fees are concentrated on the fillers and the importers of packed products. So it's not the only model, but it's the prevailing model. Now, in terms of other financial tools, I would say that starting in the comparison between EPR and DRS, EPR, when we say packaging EPR, it covers the whole of the packaging waste stream, which is, of course, many different types of packages used for many different types of products. So it's a holistic system. It can be applied in phases. It's not a big bang, and it can be applied over geographical areas over time, so that eventually can cover the whole country. So it provides this tool to cover the whole country in steps, in phases. Now, DRS is very effective in collecting certain types of material. We all know that it's only for the time being concentrating on beverage packaging. If we take the total packaging waste stream, that's around 15% of the packaging. So it's a very effective solution for a small percentage of the packaging put on the market. It's achieving very high recycling rates quickly, but it takes a big bank to implement it, which means also a lot of upfront investments. I would say that the combination of two, because we have a holistic system, which is EPR for all the packaging, and DRS for certain types of packaging, the combination of two might be the most efficient way to go forward. And of course, it's also an issue of deciding when you install each. I would say that you install EPR, and then you might also implement DRS for packaging, but this is up to the country to decide. In terms of other tools, I would say that we primarily prefer tools that support the separate collection of packaging. So things like pay as you throw, in terms of how people are paying for their refuse, for their waste, which gives incentives to people to sort. And of course, we don't like, and I think the industry overall, talking to the industry around the globe, of course, does not like the idea of taxation, paying taxes that are usually out of the control of the industry, in the control of the government, and very seldomly the fees that are collected will end up in the management of packaging. So EPR and DRS and supportive tools, supportive instruments to facilitate, to incentivize people to sort their waste, I think should be the most effective economic tools.
That's clear. Thanks you. You've also answered my last question, so I'm going to jump to the middle question. So just about the last question is again about the definition of the obligated entity. And you've now made the classification of financial obligation and other obligations. So I like that. I'm going to also use that. For me, the definition of the obligated industry is anyone who makes profit when packaging goes to the environment. So if you're a resin manufacturer or converter or brand owner or even a retailer, you need to feel the obligation, because it's your business, you make money, you need to come solve the problem. And then you make the further definition of the financial obligation. The question is around the the collection system in Malaysia. So we know we have a strong informal collection system for those material types that have got sufficient value to be recycled organically, is what I call it. There's sufficient value in the end product in order to carry the cost of conversion and transport and collection. What should the PRO target as an effective way of collecting material from the environment? Should it be using the existing collection infrastructure and build on that, or should they create a totally new collection infrastructure? Thank you.
Well, I think when you are in a country that has already an informal system in place, I don't think there is the option to build a completely new system and ignore the existing system. It should be a combination. And that combination should also make sure that whatever you install in terms of organized collection, because I strongly believe that in the course of time and when the recycling targets and the obligations of the companies for recycled content will either voluntary or through regulation go up, you will need also organized collection so that you need to ask people to sort their waste and have a system to collect it. I think it's a combination of the two, and in that combination, you should make every effort to integrate also what you call today the informal sector. You need to formalize eventually that so that you gain control on the numbers as well. Because as I said, I strongly believe that getting robust numbers from an informal sector working in the gray market is next to impossible. And of course, it's next to impossible to ensure that there is no double or triple or multiple reporting to different companies. And that's where your PRO will play a very important role, because it's not going to be one company buying and another company buying numbers and another company buying numbers, but you have an organized system to buy recycling certificates that also can exert more control on those numbers. So I should say that you should build on the existing system, help that system to integrate and formalize, and eventually also put in place organized collection of packaging, and of course, having pilots to start getting into that and learning how to do it, and dealing with the implications at pilot level will help also a lot in setting up those systems in the future, learning more about the cost, learning more about the practical implications, and also learning about integrating the informal sector. I've been in Thailand a few months ago, and I've seen the informal sector growing and how it's also eventually making steps to formalize as well. So I think you can build on that, but you also need at the same time build an organized collection and integrate the two as you move along.
All right, so thank you very much, Dr. Casper. And let's move to another question. I think there is a question from Zelina. Zelina, do you want me to read the question, or would you like to talk to us?
No, please do go ahead. I think, I have already written my question in the chat box. Thank you.
So can EPR involve multiple PROs and company-owned initiatives? So the role of company-owned initiatives, that's an important item here to discuss. To include other criteria such as cost of design, research and development, recycled content, energy efficiency, public education, etc.
Yes, well, interesting question. I will start from the experiences in Europe. In Europe, the packaging producer is once it joins a PRO, is passing on its responsibilities for packaging to the PRO. And when I say responsibilities, I mean responsibilities for collection and sorting and treatment of the material. But in terms of, and of course, the education, that doesn't mean that a company cannot have an education program as well if they want to achieve something specific, or if they want to work also on their social responsibility, corporate social responsibility. Some companies will continue running some of these programs, but of course, they are also paying for the organized communication by the PRO. And of course, there is a lot of work done on research development by the companies themselves on their own package. In developed markets, the PRO may also create like a research center or facilitate research on packaging. But of course, each company decides for their own packaging. It's not the PRO deciding about the packaging. So at the end of the day, the part on research and development and improvement of products is usually dealt by the companies. Now, in terms of operations, once we have mandatory EPR and the EPR is obliged to meet recycling targets, specific recycling targets every year, it means that the PRO should set up the system on the ground to meet these recycling targets. So in terms of operational issues on collection and sorting of material, when we have mandatory EPR, eventually we see the companies kind of phasing out their own initiatives on that part because the PRO is obliged to do this. It has to meet the recycling targets. So in most of the cases, it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep spending other money on collection of material and so on, or even buying recycling certificates. That would be the job of the PRO to make sure that they meet the recycling target. So research and development and some communication you may continue. Operational work, I would say that it will usually be phased out because it will not make a lot of financial sense anyways.
Kyriakos, we have a question from Mr. Zurairi, and if I read the question correctly, and please, Zurairi, tell me if I interpret your question in the right way. It's about the link between the EPR, the function of EPR and the PRO, and also the issue of supply and demand of rPET. So should the EPR or the PRO be concerned with increasing the supply of rPET or rHDP, or should it work in isolation from that?
Well, I think it's directly connected because we set up an EPR to meet specific recycling targets. So based on the evolution of the recycling targets in the market, the EPR needs to focus and put money and effort to collect this type of materials. Now, what is important for the industry, and that's why I mentioned a few times about the ownership of the material, especially when you set up organized collection of packaging, is to ensure, and that's part also of getting involved from the beginning, talking to the government, making sure that the legislation will not obstruct the kind of things you want to have in place on the industry side, to make sure that you have ownership of this material that is collected by organized collection systems. So if your PRO has ownership of the material, then you can set up agreements with your PRO to buy rPET, rPE by the PRO, so you don't lose control over the material. What is in the informal sector, many times you don't have control. What is in an EPR or a DRS system, you can have control provided that you set up the legislation, and that's where you need to be involved quickly. You set up the legislation in such a way that it allows your PRO to have control over the material so you can have access to the material. Of course, for the interest of the whole industry, those materials should be traded on market rates, because if you ask for trading at below market rates, it means that other materials will have to pay the difference. So you need to find a balance between the market values, but what is important for you is to have control to high quality, good quality material for increasing your recycled content. So EPR and DRS should be structured in such a way that you have control over the material. And that also affects your eventually your kind of interest to push the material towards your organized system so that you have access and control over the material.
Thank you. Very clear. We have another question from Dr. Casper on eco-modulation. Dr. Casper, do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry to ask so many questions. So on eco-modulation, you mentioned your presentation that in order to cater for the different challenges of the different material types, you eco-modulate fees based on the type of material. We also eco-modulate in some of our projects based on the value of that material, because it changes over time. There's a market, whether the primary would be virgin resin or the recycled resin price. So we have what's called a variable fee. If you have a variable, the eco-modulated fee paid to the collectors vary over time because of the varying value of the selling materials. How do we manage this in practice? Because it's difficult for us as the obligated industry to budget for something that varies all the time. I mean, in practice, how does that work in other markets? I'm curious to know.
Well, if we go back to the formula of calculating the cost minus the net cost, which means cost, collection, sorting, minus the value of the material, by definition, if you're using the cost formula, that fluctuation of the value of the material is taken into account because you subtract the value of the material. Now, fees are not set on stone in the sense that you can change fees every year or in the year if you have big fluctuations in the value of the material. So that is reflected in the actual fee per type of material. And that's why we collect the fees for each type of material to take into account also the fluctuations in the values. Now, in terms of eco-modulation, where you're trying to, for example, make sure that the difficult material that are difficult to collect or difficult to recycle, like wrappings or polystyrene or these kind of packages that are very difficult to collect because they are lightweight, they are lost, or if they are collected, they are small in quantities to sort and have an efficient recycling. Those products usually we do not have them in a category to pay their own fees. We will usually have them in an other category or other non-recoverable categories where we engineer the fees so that we transfer costs from other materials that are recycled to these type of difficult types of packages to make sure that we increase the packaging fee for these type of packages so that there is an incentive to not use them eventually, to use friendlier alternatives and so on. Now, if we take eco-modulation to the total extent, which means eco-modulating on each type of packaging, this is a complicated structure. We have examples in Belgium, in France, where we have a bonus and a malus system, where the good products are getting a bonus, the difficult products are getting a malus, but it's complicated. Even in Europe, which is now an obligation, a legal obligation, it's very difficult to apply it. It takes a very mature system. So some basic types of eco-modulation is the starting point, having the difficult material in an other category, and you engineer the fees so that this material have higher fees than the material that you actually collect and recycle.
All right, so we have almost reached our time limit, which is 4 o'clock, and it's a shame because I had some questions myself, but it's always like this, time flies when you're having fun. But let's allow a few more minutes for other questions. If you have any question, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask the question. Anybody? Don't be shy. So let me ask one question then, and then we close. Kyriakos, what should be the relationship between, for example, an EPR platform, PRO, and the current government initiatives in terms of waste management and recycling? How should we, work together to make sure that we don't step on each other's toes and then we maximize impact? Yeah, I think that's very important because we talk to stakeholders that are responsible for government-led waste management initiatives, and sometimes we have difficulties in understanding how we should work together towards the common goal. Any wisdom from your side?
Well, I would say that irrespective of whether the waste management services are offered by state organizations or local authorities or the private sector, waste management sector or whatever, if you clearly set up in your strategy what is the role of the PRO, and if you go back into what I was saying that the PRO is managing funds and should be managing projects. And the reason, and sorry, but I'm connecting back to also the definition of the producer in the discussion we had earlier. If you have the brand owners in the decision making of the PRO, you avoid a lot of conflicts of interest, because once you involve other supply chain operators that are very focused on their material, on their type of material, like resin producers or packaging manufacturers, they have a special interest on a certain type of packaging. Whereas the producers, the brand owners, and the importers, usually, especially the big companies that will be the big producers that will take part in the decision making, they usually use different type of packages. So their interests are not to favor one type of packaging, but to make sure that there is a fair system between all the types of packaging. So this is another reason why I prefer this definition, which is the prevailing definition around the globe for the producer. So once you clarify how you want to structure the PRO, and especially when you clarify that you will not vertically integrate, the PRO will not offer waste management services. So you need to buy waste management services from the industry or from the government or from the local government on a competitive basis, because you want to be efficient as well. Those are all your potential operators. Yeah. So they do what they have to do. They do collection, they do sorting. They might do in the future, but they should be working for you in order to collect and recycle your packaging. So there will be a contractual relationship between the PRO and those waste operators. Now, in terms of dealing with the government in general, I think I said already how important it is to be involved from early enough, so that you shape up the regulation. I mean, if the government is decided that the industry is going to pay, so the industry is better to be there to discuss how to take this responsibility. And you saw, for example, what kind of messages come from Europe and in Europe, which is saying, we want EPR because EPR gives us space, it gives us a role, we make sure it's efficient, we make sure it's effective, and we have access to our material if we structure it properly. But to structure it properly, you need to talk to the government early, because otherwise they will make their own decisions based on their own understanding of EPR, and it will not necessarily be aligned with your interests as well at industry level.
Okay, very clear. So time to close this workshop, this session. Rodrigo or Kyriakos, if you want to give like 2 words, remarks, final remarks, otherwise we close.
Oh, the only, I think what I closed my earlier comment, that it's very important to be involved from the beginning and work with the government to find the best solutions. Explain to them what are the best solutions for the industry, because they don't necessarily know, or they are not necessarily interested about all your interests. So by being there and being part of the evolution, solves a lot of problems that you might find in the process if you're not involved, if you're not there.
Okay, very clear. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for your time, for your participation. It's been a pleasure. I think it's been very useful to me. I hope it's been useful to all of you. And you will receive the presentation slides and the report on Malaysia in the coming days. Take care, have fun, and we'll talk to you soon.
Wait, can we take a picture?
Yeah, now.
Oh, you need to share the screen first.
Thank you.
Is Kyriakos, can you unshare the screen and we take a picture of the...
I did already, yeah.
Oh.
Oh, dear.
Okay.
No, just 1 second. I probably close the computer. Yeah.
From your computer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's have a look.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone, have a lovely week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.